All right, welcome everyone to the Xojo webinar. I am Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist, and our topic this time is database development. So before we dive right into that, I wanted to talk a little bit about Xojo. We have a lot of new people attending today. So Xojo is a programming language. It's actually several things in one: a programming language, and a framework, and an integrated development environment. That's the tool, the app that you would actually use to make your own apps. And we like to say, and our customers often say, that Xojo allows you to develop faster. Because Xojo lets you make apps for just about anything. You can make Windows apps, Mac OS, Linux apps, Raspberry Pi apps. You can make web apps. You can make iOS apps. And Android apps are coming later this year. Xojo's free to use. As a developer, you can download Xojo. You can use it. You can code with it. You can make your apps. You only need to purchase Xojo when you're ready to deploy. So that means you're ready to build your app to send it off for others to use. But up until that point, you can use Xojo for free. And if you haven't heard about Xojo before, Xojo's actually been around since 1998. It's had a few name changes throughout the years, but the name has been Xojo since 2013, and the product itself has been growing and maturing over time. When it was first released in 1998, it was Mac only, but now, as you can see, it works and runs on a wide variety of things. So what does Xojo have for database support? Well, it can connect to a lot of databases. Xojo itself isn't a database tool. It doesn't have an integrated database or anything like that. It is a programming tool that lets you connect to whatever database you want to use. SQLite is the first one I want to mention. That is a popular open source single user database. The rest of these are primarily database servers. So Xojo can, of course, connect to Postgres, the popular open source database, and MySQL, and its companion MariaDB. Microsoft SQL Server support is available for your Windows apps. Oracle support is available. And then Xojo also has generic support for the ODBC database connection mechanism. So as long as you have an ODBC driver to any other type of database, you can just use that in conjunction with ODBC and Xojo to connect to pretty much any database that you have lying around. And in addition to the stuff that Xojo comes with, there are many other third-party libraries and databases that are available for use with Xojo. So a lot of options when it comes to database support with Xojo. Now, when you're working with databases in Xojo, you're primarily going to do that using coding. You don't drag databases and do database layouts and connect them to user interfaces or anything like that, because that's a little bit restrictive. So with Xojo, you would do coding. And the general process is you're going to create the database using some sort of tool that works with the database of your choice. In Xojo, you will connect to the database. And then there are a few classes related to databases that often have the word database in them, surprisingly enough. And one of the classes here is database. That's kind of the parent class for everything. And it has on it a method called SQL select. And that is used to retrieve data from the database. So you get back a record set that you can loop through and pull back the information that you requested from the database. And then you can do what you want with that information, display it in the user interface, store it in your own local array of classes or whatever you want. And you can do what you want with it at that point. Another method that is available is the SQL execute method. This lets you run pretty much any SQL command on the database. This can be things like insert statements or create table statements or anything like that. Whenever you send database commands off to your database of choice, you always want to check the error flags in the database class to see if the command worked properly. That way you don't end up with odd behavior in your apps. So after you send a command, you check the error property to see if it's true. And if it is, you need to then check the error message property to see what error you should probably be displaying, and then maybe handling in some manner. So that's the overall process. Let's talk briefly about a couple of the database types in specific. All right, so SQLite. This is probably the most popular one that people use with Xojo. As I mentioned, this is an open source database. It is also primarily single user. It is intended to work with a single connection to your app at one time. So if this is a desktop app, the SQLite database file would also reside on the computer that the app is installed on. If this is a web app, the SQLite database can reside on the server where the web app resides. And that is fine because the web app is essentially the single user to the SQLite database. When you work with SQLite, you're going to want to find a dedicated database tool to help you design your SQLite databases, query them, do stuff like that. There's a wide variety of those out there. You can check app stores for your platform to see what is available. And you can create the database. You can create it using your tool. What I often will do is design the database using a tool and then maybe get the SQL statements back from the tool and then use those to create the database. You have a lot of flexibility there depending on how your app needs to operate. An important thing to think about with SQLite is where you put the database file, because you obviously are going to want to write to it. So you have to put it in a writable location. And so that means you want to pick a location the operating system, provides read-write access to. So Xojo has a special way to look that up. You can use the special folder module and the application data method to get back the standard system location on the various operating systems that apps use to store read-write information, such as database files like this. So that's a good location to use. You can also prompt the user and let them choose where they want to save the SQLite file, in case they want to put it in documents or desktop or wherever. But some things you want to avoid is putting the SQLite database file right next to the app itself, like in the application folder or anything like that. On many user installations, of course, the newer operating systems restrict write access to that folder. And that is going to prevent your database from running very well. I want to remind people that are maybe typing things in the chat. I can't quite see those at the moment, so use the Q&A window if you can on the toolbar. So next to the app, you want to try and avoid that if possible. And then SQLite also really should not have its database file placed on a file server. The SQLite folks that make the database really strongly advise against that. They claim there's issues with most file systems and how they handle locking and other things that could lead to data corruption for SQLite databases that are accessed by multiple apps because it is sitting on a file server. And generally speaking, with SQLite, you're going to connect to the database when your app starts, and then you will be able to use it throughout your app for retrieving data, saving data, that sort of thing. One common technique you see is to add a property that's simply called DB as SQLite database right on your main app object of your Xojo app, and then you can access that everywhere throughout your application. We'll look at an example of this in a moment so you can see what the code might actually look like. Now I want to briefly talk about Postgres and MySQL. I lump them together because they're both server databases. They're both open source. They're both popular. People generally pick one or the other. They don't tend to overlap between them, but working with them is pretty similar from Xojo's perspective. So these are database servers. So they need to be installed separately. Often they're on their own installation elsewhere, but you can, of course, install them on your own computer for development purposes. And then when the server installed, you would create the database in the server, and then you can connect to it. If you use macOS, I strongly recommend, and you're interested, of course, in Postgres, I recommend that you take a look at this postgresapp.com location. It has this great download that essentially gives you a entirely functional PostgreSQL server in a single app. You can just double click it, and that's it. You don't have to install anything. It has a little menu bar controller that lets you turn the database on and off, that sort of thing. So it's really handy for testing and development purposes. You'll want a database tool, of course, to be able to connect to these databases and see the tables and data that's in there, then to manage and configure it. And it's important to consider security risks when you're connecting to a database server across the internet. Generally speaking, that's to be avoided because you're going to have to leave some ports open for the database, and that kind of means your database server has portions of it that are publicly accessible, bit of a security risk. So you want to just consider that. There's ways around that, of course. The most common setup for these sort of things is probably an internal network or something like that, which isn't a security risk. If you go through a VPN or some sort of tunneling system, that eliminates that as well. And then with the server in place, you just tell Xojo to connect to it. And you have to provide the information about where the server is, of course. So you need to tell it the host, the port, and the connection information, user ID and password. And because this is a server and the database is, apart from the app, more than likely, it's possible the connection could drop for one reason or another, networking troubles, server issues, who knows? So your app should check for this sort of situation and then just reconnect as necessary. And much like anything else, you always want to be checking for any errors. These could be errors in your SQL statements. It could be errors in any SQL statement you send along, but if you made a typo or something, it's easier from debugging purposes if you actually check the errors that come back so you can get the message right up on the screen that tells you, oh, I made a mistake in my select statement or something like that. Now, those are the common databases that are used. So a little bit about, which databases you can use, which type of platforms. Well, desktop can use all the database types that I've talked about and listed up here. There's no restrictions on any of that. Web apps also support all the database types. If you're using SQLite with a web app, there is a property we have on there called multi-user that you can set to true. That's a little bit misnamed, but it actually turns on this cool SQLite feature called write-ahead logging. And it essentially allows SQLite to just perform a little bit faster when writing to the database. Because SQLite is, generally speaking, a single user database, only one person can write, only one connection can write to it at a time, so it'll lock and make other connections wait. But with this property set to true, the writes will happen much more quickly, making things a little bit more seamless when you have a lot of data writing happening with it. iOS is a little bit more restricted. You can use SQLite with iOS, and those database files would just exist right on the iOS device. But iOS itself does not allow direct database server connections because of the mobile nature of it. That really wouldn't be practical anyway, but none of those libraries or anything are included on the device. So instead, you need to use web services. This allows you to create essentially HTTP, connectionless internet services that can communicate with anything, but you can make a web service that essentially is like a front end to your database. And then your iOS app would talk to the web service. The web service communicates with the database, gets what it needs, packages it up, sends it back to the iOS app for it to do what it needs. So before we jump into the demo, I want to point out a few resources that are available to you when using databases with Xojo. First of all, there are a few classes and libraries that can help you work with databases. The first is Active Record and its companion product, RGen. And this is what's called an ORM tool. That's Object Relational Manager tool. And it essentially gives you a way to create Xojo classes that map to the tables and columns that are in your database. You can find Active Record on the Bikini website. And I believe Active Record is free to use, and the RGen tool has a small cost associated with it. There's another open source project called Storm. This is one I made years ago. It's a little out of date at this point, but the full source code is available. It's also an ORM. Works a little differently than Active Record. The source code might be useful for people that want to get an idea how to make this sort of thing. But it, again, provides a way for you to have your Xojo classes or create Xojo classes that communicate directly with database tables and columns. The Luna open source project, available on GitHub, provides a way for you to implement web services that can communicate with databases. I believe Luna works with MySQL, Postgres, and perhaps SQLite. I don't recall offhand. But it's kind of a framework that you can implement and then put in your own connection information and your own methods to get the types of data that you need for how your web services and database are designed. As far as documentation goes, the Xojo Dev Center has several topics in the user guide on these particular things, and I can point you here to the SQLite, Postgres, and MySQL sections. So you can refer there for code samples and specifics on the various features of these particular databases that are useful and how they can be used with Xojo itself. And if you want to look at example projects, which we're going to look at a couple here in a moment, there are a variety of examples included with Xojo in the database folder for these databases and others as well. All right, so let's switch over to Xojo and take a look at some examples. All right, so here I have Xojo open. I opened a SQLite example project. So this kind of gives you a overview of what Xojo itself looks like. You've got left-hand side is what we call the navigator, which is a list of the items in your project. The center is the editing area that will change depending on what you happen to be looking at. Right now, we're looking at the layout of a window. And then the right is the properties or the library of controls. You can switch the right-hand side between those two. So right now I'm looking at a layout of a very simple window that has buttons for a few features that this SQLite example does. So I'm going to just run this. And you can see here, I'll click the Create button, and I'll get prompted to choose the name of a file and where I want to save it. I'm going to replace the one I have there. So I've now created a SQLite database file on my desktop. I can click this button here. We'll look at the code in a moment. This creates a table in that database. This has some code here to add some rows to the table. And then here, this is retrieving the data from the table and showing it here in this grid, where I can click on rows. And then here in the grid, I can click the edit button for a particular row. It shows me the information, and I can make changes, and I can save them, and I can re-request it to see that the changes were actually saved to the database file. If I hit add again, I suspect I'll get those same rows added repeatedly. So kind of it shows you some of the common things you tend to do in a database app. And really the only things that are going to be different when you're working with Xojo among all the different database types is, how you're going to connect to the database itself. Everything else is largely going to be the same. So let's look at what some of that code might look like here. So if I just double click on the button, that'll jump me to the action event handler where the code is when the button is clicked. And you can see this code here is just prompting the user, this first line, prompt the user for the file. And we're going to delete it if it already exists and then recreate it. And this here is the code to create a new SQLite database. We point it to the file, and then we call the create database file method to create the file on disk. And you see I'm using the app.db property that, make sure I open the app that I have defined right here. And now the rest of the code will refer to app.db whenever it needs to talk to or communicate to the SQLite database. All right, so that is the create button. I got a question about the saving, so I want to rerun this and make sure that did what I expected. So if I change a row, if I reload, yeah, that is still reloading the row here that I edited. If I add more rows, so I add 3 new rows, it'll add the first 3 rows with the one I edited and then the same 4 that I keep adding every time. All right, so we got here the create button. So the next thing here is the code that creates the team table. And you see this is just standard SQL here. I've put the SQL statement in a string. And a good way to get this SQL statement, if you're not, super fluent in SQL, is use your database tool, design the table how you want. And pretty much every database tool I've ever used has some option to show you the actual SQL statement that is generated by what you did. And then you can use that here with Xojo. So here I assign that to a string, and then I can use the command I mentioned earlier, the SQL execute, to tell it to run that SQL on the database. And that creates the table. So the steps involve, well, you actually have to create the database first. Then you got to create the tables for where you want to put the data. And then we can add some data to the table that we just created. So you can see here, this method is calling another function, which we'll look at, that is adding some data, 3 rows of data, our different names here. So that's we just hard code to add some raw data here each time. And if we go to that method, you can see here that it is adding the rows by creating a database record, that's a Xojo class, assigning the values to each of the column names that are passed in to the method, and then calling the insert record method to insert this database record into the team table. And that adds these rows to that table. So we've finished step 3 here. We've added the sample data to the team table. And then the last thing would be, well, let's actually show this data so that we can verify that it was saved into the table. This here is just calling the show data method, which is down here. And you can see that right down here, there's a loop. Generally speaking, when you have multiple rows of data, you're going to loop through them in some way. So what this code is doing is first just clearing out the grid each time to make sure it's empty. Our SQL statement is very simple. We're just selecting everything from the team table. And then we call the SQL select method, pass in our SQL statement. And then here we can verify we got a result back. And then we do a loop. We loop through it until we reach the end. EOF would mean the end. And then we can add each value as a row in that list box / grid. And then the last thing that we do here is, well, not the last thing, but the next step is we save the primary key. That's in the ID column. We save that in an invisible tag field so that it can be used later. And then we call move next to move to the next row in the select statement that was returned. And this will loop through typically the first 3 rows, because that's how many we added, and add them to the list. So that gets you through the first 3 steps here. And generally speaking, I mean, that's how a typical app you're going to want to start off. You're going to need to connect or create your database file. You're going to need to set up its structure and populate it with any data if necessary. And then you provide ways to display the data. The other thing I showed you in this app is you can have a row of data selected here, and you can click the edit button to edit the data. And what happens here is it determines which row you've selected, and then it fetches the information from the list box. So first it gets the primary key from that invisible tag column so that can be used. And then it gets the name and the coach and the city right directly from the cells. And then it creates a new window, and it calls the method on the window to fill in the fields that are on the window, and then displays the window as a modal window. So if we look at the window, it's right here. You can see it has 3 fields for each of those columns. And I can expand that. You can see the method here is just setting the values for each of the fields. And then the save button has the code to actually update the database itself with whatever is in those fields. So if you change them or type something new in, this is what updates the database. So here it gets the values that are in the field, stores them in variables, creates an SQL statement to apply those changes to the database. Here it's using an update. And we're going to be setting the name, coach, and city with using a specific primary key. And here this is using what's called a prepared statement. So the placeholders are just question marks in the SQL statement. And they're filled in this code right here, where for each of the parameters, we tell it the type, and then we tell it the value to stick in it. So in the first one, we're telling it it's text. We want the name. The second one is also text, the coach value, text, and the city value. And the last one is an integer and the primary key value. And once that's specified, you call the SQL execute command to tell the database to run that, and that updates the data in the table. And that's pretty much the pattern that is used for all database apps in Xojo. You connect to the database, create the structure that you need, tables and whatnot, add initial data that is needed or data that the user creates. You can display it and then let user edit it, add more data, that sort of thing. All right, I want to switch to the Postgres one. And you can see this looks pretty much the same. I didn't put the editing function on this because that would look exactly the same as the SQLite example. But the big difference here is going to be what the code looks like in the connect. Let's first make sure this runs, since I had to do that restart earlier and make sure my server came back online. All right, good. I need to delete that first. And this is why you want to have a database tool handy. So here I'm going to fire up a tool called Navicat. And I can tell it to connect to the demo database I have running here on this computer. And I can navigate to stuff and I can see my my information. So it looks like maybe I can delete the table here and then tell the app to recreate it. Oh, it's not, wasn't the team table, it's this team sequence that already exists. I'm not seeing where Navicat is showing me the sequences, so let us delete that manually. Well, I don't see how to delete that, so we're going to do this the manual way then. We will show you a little bit of debugging. I'm going to go to the create table here. I'm going to copy the SQL statement. And then I'm going to go back to Navicat. And since I can't figure out how to delete a sequence using Navicat, I will see if it just lets me create the table in here manually. And all right, so now I have a team here, and it does have the stuff. So if I come back here, if I skip this step, I should be able to just have it add. And if I come back here, click the refresh, we can see in Navicat that the rows that Xojo added are now added to the SQLite database. I'm sorry, the PostgreSQL database on the server. And then if I click show here, you can see Xojo is able to fetch them back. So looking back at the Xojo code, the big thing I wanted to point out was the slight difference in the connection. So you can see rather than creating a database file like you did with SQLite, you actually have to provide information about where the database server is. And then username and password, and the name of the database. And then once you have all that information specified, you just connect. So slightly different than how the SQLite code is, because that's actually creating a file. And this is connecting to an existing server. But otherwise, the code looks pretty much the same. You know, as you saw here, the create table command that we copied into Navicat to apply manually looks, I think, almost exactly the same as the SQLite create table. SQL syntax, of course, can vary slightly between database implementations. SQLite, Postgres, and MySQL all have their own little idiosyncrasies when it comes to SQL. So you might need to tweak that. But generally speaking, people don't jump between different databases too often. You pick one, and that's the one your app is using throughout. Oh, and here's the sequence. I think someone left a comment that indicated the sequence might be listed under other somewhere. So I missed it here. Oh, I did miss it. It's right there. Yeah, so I just needed to come here earlier and delete that, and then that would have worked. Thank you for the tip, Michael. And if we take a look at MySQL, which I won't be able to connect to at the moment because of the restart, my server on that one I do know went offline. But you can see this is also the same, using a different class, of course, rather than the PostgreSQL database server class. It's the MySQL community server class. You still have to provide the host, username, password, database, and port, and all that good stuff. But once you do that, again, things kind of work the same. Create table looks very similar. Might have slightly different syntax on this one. But otherwise, the rest of the code, in particular the code that loops through the database to get the values, looks the same. So really the trick is to choose the database you prefer to work with, and then you can use it in Xojo that way. But if you did need to switch databases for some reason or another, very similar working between the different database types. All right, let's jump back in here. And then we'll get to the end. I have a bunch of questions that are queued up that we will go through. So why should you be using Xojo? Well, lots of other people are using Xojo, so you can see that it makes a lot of stuff. Over 200,000 people are using Xojo to make their own apps. Often many, if not most of them, are using databases in some manner. With Xojo, you get to use and learn just a single tool that lets you make lots of different types of apps, as I showed you earlier. Lots of desktop apps, web apps, iOS apps, Android coming later in the year. Kind of covers all your bases that way. In general, Xojo puts simplicity first. So we want to make a full-featured programming tool that people can actually use. So it's not limited in any way, like more simpler tools that are just front ends to database designs and don't give you a lot of programming capability. So it's pretty simple to use, but it is still a full-featured programming tool, so you can make whatever it is you want to make. And it allows you to develop faster because of these things. And an important thing with making software is you actually finish it and you ship it, right? And as I mentioned earlier, Xojo is free to use, so you can download it, start using it right away, no cost. And then you purchase it when you are ready to build and send along or make apps available for others to use. And one thing I always like to point out is that, well, using Xojo also can be kind of fun. Other tools sometimes can get a little annoying to work with or frustrating, and our Xojo users tend to report that, generally speaking, they really enjoy programming and coding and using Xojo. Our Xojo Developer Conference for 2018 is coming up in April, and it's in Denver, Colorado. And just this week, or it might have been late last week, it's sold out. So yeah, I feel bad now. I'm telling you all about this great conference, and you might not be able to go to it. But you can email us at xdc@xojo.com. You can get added to the waiting list. And also, you can follow us on Twitter or subscribe to the Xojo blog. That's blog.xojo.com. And we'll be posting updates from the conference in April. Pictures, videos. We'll be doing a few live streams as well. So you stay tuned there. You can get a feel for some of the stuff that's happening. And also typically, and what we're doing this year as well, is after the conference, a month or two afterwards, the videos for the conference are all made available for sale and purchase for people that were unable to attend. And the videos are actually free for attendees, but others can access them as well. So head on over to xojo.com/download. You can start playing around with it today. There are a few free books that are available as well. The Introduction to Programming, if you are just starting out. We also have a Raspberry Pi book for those that are interested in that. And of course, you can check out our user community in the Xojo forum. And always check out the Xojo Dev Center. That's developer.xojo.com. The database section of the user guide is located here, which has topics on all the databases I've talked about today, in addition to many others. I'll be going through a bunch of questions in a moment. But if you do have questions at any point afterwards that you didn't think of, you can always contact me. I'm paul@xojo.com via email, @Lefevre on Twitter. And when you are ready to purchase Xojo, I encourage you to take advantage of this coupon code here, new 2018, to save 10% on your purchase license. All right, great. I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. And again, if you think of questions later, contact me, paul@xojo.com or @Lefevre on Twitter. I'm happy to talk with anyone that is using or considering using Xojo to see if it might fit their needs. Have a great day, everyone.